Okay, so it looks like we're live.
Yeah.
So I'm going to get started. Thank you for coming to Book Sandwiched In. Today we're joined by Dana Mills. Dana is a writer, an activist, and a dancer. She's the author of Dance and Politics, Moving Beyond Boundaries, Rosa Luxemburg, which we talked about in January. You can check that out on our YouTube or our Facebook. And the book we're talking about today is right here, Dance and Activism, 100 Years of Radical Dance Across the World. Dana is the Director of Development and Foreign Relations for Peace Now. You also have a very long background in dancing yourself and in academics. I'm going to hand it over to you if you want to chat a little bit about
who I am and why I'm here. So first of all, thank you so much for having me. I have to confess, we had so much fun talking about my Rosa Luxemburg books, and I was like, yes, I definitely want to talk to you again. So I'm very grateful for the invitation and for the hosting. A little bit about myself and a little bit of a proviso. So I am speaking to you guys from Tel Aviv, Israel, which is my homeland. I'm half Israeli, half Welsh. No one can guess my accent, so I say that right away to not mess with you for like an hour. Would be like, where is she from? I can't really place it. But I was raised here, and this is really home in the most profound way. And I joined Peace Now when I was 13, just after Yitzhak Rabin was killed, Israeli Prime Minister, who tried to sign accords with the Palestinians in the 90s. And my entire high school was basically being active in Peace Now and being a human rights peace activist as an Israeli. And that really shaped my worldview. And I ended up doing a bunch of other things. I did a PhD and taught as an academic until like 2 weeks ago. So this is really recent. Last time we talked, I was like, yes, I'm an academic. Now I'm like, no, I'm no longer an academic. So big change in my life. And I should say as a proviso that I'm doing this talk privately as the author of Dance and Activism and not on behalf of Peace Now. I'm happy to take questions vaguely, generally about the organization and what we do. This basically been part of my education, but I'm not here in a formal capacity. It's really important for me to say, because I was chatting to Rory earlier before we went live, and I think, this book is really the thing that pushed me to go back into activism and to basically leave an academic career and a writing career and to go back to the field and do grassroots work. And what I'm seeing now is so interesting, working with a bunch of people who are all incredibly committed, and that's really their life. Like, they don't care about prestige or ego, like they want to get things done for the common good. And I feel it's a very different responsibility. Like, if I get they strong within my book, that's my book, and then I take the responsibility. But there's a lot riding on other people's work that I'm just getting to know again. So getting back to Peace Now and having a role of Director of Foreign Relations Development is a massive thing for me. It's really coming full circle with what educated me, what taught me about social justice. I like to think of myself, present myself as coming from the wrong side of history, as an Israeli advocating for human rights in the occupied West Bank and Gaza, and talking about Palestinian human rights. It's not an easy position, perhaps, but it's one that is very necessary, and it's how I learned my politics. So this is a bit of a proviso about who I am now. And I have to confess that I looked through the book today and I'm like, oh, I kind of forgot I wrote all these things, although it's only been out for like a month and a bit, because it's just like a different phase of my life. But which is why I'm so grateful for this opportunity to discuss it, because I was like, that's a good excuse to actually go back to my own book. So thank you for having me.
All right, so I have a bunch of notes. I really enjoyed this one. Let's see. So I'm going to start with the concepts of solidarity and alienation are woven throughout the whole book. Can you speak to the significance of those two themes and how they sort of play upon one another?
Yeah, so thank you. I think I've been interested in the concept of alienation for a while. It's not very fashionable. My training is in political theory. That's kind of my academic world. But alienation has kind of gone out of fashion. It's very archaic in many circles, and it's been heavily used and interpreted by the Frankfurt School and a lot of people who came out of the Frankfurt School, including Rahel Yegi, who I quote and use heavily in the book. Is a great contemporary social and political theorist. But there's been a lot of baggage to do with the concept of alienation because it's derived originally from Marx. Like all good things in political theory, it comes directly from Marx. But the question that comes together with alienation is what is the thing that we're trying to get away from? So if we are alienated from human beings, which is we are disconnected from our authentic selves, we are disconnected from society, we're disconnected from our work, what is the authentic being towards which we are trying to get back? And a challenge that I've been debating quite a bit when I was writing the book, I talked to a lot of people about it, is we're trying to get away from an essentialist view that there is something, there is the heaven that is there, that we need to return to, something that is lost and we need to recreate. And I think it's a very important challenge because a lot of what we see now in the work of anti-racist movements and the work of really solidarity movement is going against this essentialist view, because the truth is none of us have an idea of what it's like to live in an equal society. Like none of us have this experience. So we can't go back in time. We need to aspire to something new. So my conceptual way out of this dilemma has been tapping into the concept of solidarity, which is something that I've been interested in more, I would say, as an activist. And I noticed that a lot of people around me sign emails or texts and say in solidarity, and it's kind of a speech act. It's something I actually do to show, I'm working with you, I'm equal to you in this action. And I thought there's something very deep about thinking about solidarity as the counter concept, really, the concept in dialectic to alienation, which basically enabled me to give a more forward-looking vision and not going back and saying, oh, things were better before capitalism. Of course, things will be better after capitalism, but looking at the collective aspiration that can push us forward rather than, going back. So this was my motivation. And I have to say, my previous Rosa book had a lot of political theory in it, obviously, but this one was perhaps ironically more political theory heavy. And I was like, I really enjoy doing that. Like, it's nice playing with concept and trying to see what works and what doesn't, and going back to texts and interpreting them from the core. So it was fun for me, at least.
You did a good job with that. Like usually political theory is sort of intimidating to me. Like it's up here and I'm not quite able to grasp it, but you make it really accessible. I think also it helps to, use it through the lens of dance and stuff, because then you're talking about something beautiful and fun, and it's a lot easier to understand. So the book, the way you wrote the book, it's very heavily rooted in feminism, and lots of Marxist theory, as you mentioned. I love it. Like I was only on page 5 and Eleanor is there already. That was fun. So you had written that other women and feminist theory in general played a part in shaping the book. Did you intend originally to approach it from a more feminist lens, or was it just the influence of those people? And how might the book have been different, do you feel, if you hadn't taken that approach?
That's a great question again. So I have to say my route into feminism was maybe not the orthodox one, in the sense that I only started calling myself a feminist when I was like 25, 26, 27. And when I moved really to the UK to pursue my PhD. And when I was growing up in Israel, really the only thing we cared about was the occupation. That was the only thing we talked about. And it's not to say that there's gender equality in Israel, there isn't, but I never saw myself as someone who's speaking from the side of the oppressed. I never saw myself as someone who has to defend their own rights. My position was very much defending rights of someone else. And I think I was really lucky because I met some incredible women who really shaped my world. And that also helped me think about women who shaped my world, who were not there, women from the past who I was reading and I was dancing, repertoire and learning and reading about and engaging. And then I realized that I was actually very kind of heavily influenced by a lot of very strong-minded women. And it was kind of a gradual process for me to start engaging with feminism. And I think, I know that you and I share the commitment for socialist feminism, which is, I'll talk about Eleanor later. I think she deserves her own chat. Mm-hmm. But maybe one place where I was skeptical about feminism as a driving force is that a lot of what we see, especially in the West, in the UK and the US, is very white neoliberal feminism that basically says women, everyone else. And that never spoke to me because, again, my worldview comes from a very different place and gender relations here are very different. And there's a lot of other factors that play into your life before you start sort of even approaching the woman question, as Eleanor would say. So I think for me, it was kind of, I had to come through the whole circle and to say, yeah, it's only socialist feminism I'm interested in. And of course, talking about other forms of oppression, which are sexuality and race, of course, and a lot of, nationality, being devoid of nationality. I wrote quite a bit about refugees. I think that's a burning question that we often omit. And again, coming from Israel, talking about Palestinian refugees, you can't not think about what it means to be stateless. Like if you don't even have the very basic category of belonging, what happens then? If you don't even have a law that oppresses you, it's just like you're in a void, really. So I think for me, the book was maybe a culmination of a process and one that I had to go through and sort of saying, yes, I'm a feminist, but of that specific genre, and being committed to a very strong legacy that we don't read about a lot. Usually if you talk about feminism, it is a very specific reading of feminism. It's one that's very much talking about legal rights rather than economic equality. And it's one that doesn't look at intersections. Even though we have the language, it's still kind of like, oh, we have this extra person who will do the intersectionality. Like all of us will just talk about women and that's fine. Maybe that's my experience only, but that has really been my experience. Like whenever I went to feminist events in the UK, it was like lots of women talking and then like, here's a woman talking about Black feminism. Here's a woman talking about working class. And you're like, yeah, that's not intersectionality, is it though? Like you didn't really get it. So yeah, that's kind of my journey into feminism in the book.
So this sort of flows with what you were saying as well. So at the start of the book, you wrote that intersectional justice sits at the heart of the book's argument. And it's sort of like what you were saying. It's not uncommon to read a book about activism, or especially a book about feminism, that claims that at the beginning, and then you don't really hear much about other people besides the typical white neoliberal woman throughout. So what I was impressed with was that, although I shouldn't be surprised because you wrote it, that the book touches upon so many social justice topics. Like when I had finished it, I couldn't believe how quickly I read through it, because it feels like it should be much thicker with all the topics that you addressed, because you've got feminism, sexism in there, racism, Afrocentrism. I've not read many books that come from a feminist approach that mention Afrocentrism. That was like really cool. Refugees, as you said. So it's very comprehensive. Did the dancers and the dance pieces that you were writing about sort of influence that or play into that? Or did you have those topics in mind and then it was sort of the opposite, where you searched out for a certain piece or a certain dancer?
So this book was really written, I see it as a collaborative book. A lot of people, I wouldn't say just influenced it, but they really kind of pushed me to write the different case studies. And a lot of the people I write about are friends and comrades and people I know personally, which is really stressful, by the way. Like I much prefer, like after doing Rosa, I was like, no, if I get anything wrong, she's not there. She's not going to come back and be like, no, I didn't say that. But when you're writing about someone who's alive and is a colleague and you're like, oh, I really want to get everything right, like the stress is very different. So it definitely was one of those books where I just found myself finding topics and seeing how they were interweaving into each other. And I went with intuition. At this point, you know, it's my third book. I was like, okay, I find this interesting. I just want to write about it. And I think, you know, if you write about things that you love and you care about, then you'll engage the reader well. And I think for me, a lot of people kind of got the book going. It wasn't that I kind of sat and planned chapters, but I was like, oh, that's a really, really important person doing really important work. Or I just, you know, I looked through archives and I found a piece that I was like, this is incredible. I want to write about that. And out of that came really everything around it. And I think it was really interesting because, you know, thinking about curation and thinking about, representation, which is a very hot topic. I mean, I should say that I'm no longer in the UK. I feel very relieved. They've just published a report that basically says that the UK is not institutionally racist, published and written by people who don't believe there's such a thing as institutional racism. And you're like, good luck with that. You know, this is perfect for you guys. But I think one of the problems we see in diversity and kind of with the concept of diversity itself, which I feel very uneasy about, because I want to talk about justice and I want to talk about representation. I want things to be at their core just and not performance. What's weird is that when I finished the book, I actually realized that I had more non-European, non-white subjects than white European subjects. And it wasn't intentional at all. I didn't sort of sit and think, I need to do all this work. But it just happened because, you know, the really interesting stuff that was going on. So I have a whole chapter on protest movements and, you know, looking at the Arab Spring and looking at the protests in Argentina and in parts of the world that you don't typically see on your 9 o'clock news or whatever. Like that was the thing that got me going and got me thinking. And then in there I was like, yeah, I'll put one Australia in there to make people happy, to make them feel at home. Or like I'll put one from London, just to, you know, to make people happy about that. But there's something, you know, in going back to the ethos of the book, when we talk about activism, where we are now and where I am now, like the really important, interesting work is not necessarily happening in the places that think themselves as important. You know, there's incredible work done. I don't want to use the concept of the global South. I hate it very deeply. But if you look at South America and Brazil, obviously the anti-Bolsonaro work is incredible. You look at East Europe, you know, the post-Soviet world and what's going on there, especially with regards to reproductive rights, feminism, that's really, really important. And then, you know, my little corner of the world that everyone has an opinion about, and it's so burning and it's so like, you can't not watch the news every day something happens and you can't not engage. So I think, you know, if you're really trying to do a global book on activism, it's likely in the end to be very kind of geared towards places that maybe are not orthodox for, again, you know, a kind of British American style writing. But for me, I was like, yeah, the really interesting stuff happens in South Africa and in Cairo and in Erbil in Iraq and in Lebanon, because, you know, that's where the struggle is at its core. That's where people are really fighting really, really significant, important fights. So I kind of came full circle with that also, I guess.
So we've sort of talked about this before, but we're both, well, I don't like to call myself a writer because I'm not published, but I do like to write. You're definitely a writer, right? So, and you have the background in dance, and I'm very fond of the theater. I was very active in the theater as a kid, especially in college. And I think like the really beautiful thing about creative ventures, and especially the arts as a whole in general, is that it's such a great catalyst for activism.
Yeah.
But we hear a lot of talk about like music and art pieces and theater and writing about activism, but not so much about dancing. And you had touched upon that in the book, that it's almost in a sense a first of its kind. Why do you think that is? And how does that play into the lack of research on that topic?
I mean, one reason I love dance is that it's kind of the underdog of the arts. Like, you can get a lot of things done in an art form that is not at the center of discourse. I mean, the negative side of it is it's typically underfunded. It's typically the art form that will not, you know, get the big prizes and get the big budgets. which is hard. Dancers' lives are really, really hard and precarious. But you can get a lot of things done. You can get a lot of subversive messages through when you go under the radar. And I think a lot of things I wrote about wouldn't have happened if it was an art form that people feel differently about. So I want to say a few things about why I think dance is underappreciated. I don't want to say I don't want to say anything offensive, but I do want to say it's underappreciated. I think, first of all, people are afraid of bodies. And when I say people, especially again in the West, there is the fear of the physical, there's the fear of the visceral, and dance is an art form that completely relies on the physical. So I think some people will be afraid of that. It also pushes you as a spectator to really deal with your own physicality, to think about your own body, what it can do, what it can't do, what do you want it to do for you. And I think there is, again, I'm talking about certain cultures, not obviously all cultures, but there is a repression of the embodied that we know, which also, again, is a feminist point. I mean, there's the great Genevieve Lloyd book, Man of Reason, that says, man rational, woman emotional, physical, and then, all the politics that goes with that. And then there's another element of dance, which is really interesting and important, I think, for the kind of stuff we're talking about, which is the fact that it doesn't have a score. It doesn't have anything that remains after it's done. There's a wonderful Merce Cunningham quote that everyone quotes, and I'm going to quote also because it's wonderful. And it says, you have to dance, you have to love dance to stick to it. It gives you nothing back. No paintings to hang on walls, no poems to publish, only the one moment when you feel alive. And, as a writer, I have this thing, I can hold it, I can feel it. But before this, I took a ballet class and there's no memory of that. There's something that has disappeared. And when it comes to conveying messages that could be dangerous and could be, that really are subversive and really project something that is not yet here, there is something that is very generative about that element of dance, that, if you publish a book that is subversive, like we all know the Rushdie Affair and we all know these kind of banned book stories, with dance, like you have a performance, and if you perform a subversive dance, it's done and the audience will carry it and the dancer will carry it, but there's nothing in the world that can be held against you. So I think that's a really important trait of dance, that both makes it vulnerable, because again, great performances are over and we have different ways to record it, but we don't have a physical entity that is left, but also gives it a lot of potential that other art forms don't have.
Let's see. I'm kind of skipping. I have so many notes, so I keep looking down. I'm like, So I watched, I think I mentioned this to you in email prior to it, but you have very descriptive commentaries on the dances that you profiled in the book. So it was easy to kind of picture it in my head, but I went on YouTube and tried to find some of them. So I watched a couple of the dances. I watched Strange Fruit, Steps in the Street, is it called, from Chronicle, and a couple others. And the one that was especially stirring for me, I watched the Echoes of Erbil. I'm gonna massacre all of these titles, but Hussein, I don't know how to pronounce his last name. Simcoe. Yeah. And so when you wrote about him in the book, you had mentioned that he never appears as anyone but himself. So no matter what movement language the audience sees on stage, he's always him telling the story. So we were talking about theater before, and that's what I have the most background with as far as, performing arts. Theater is a great way to, have activism on stage. But the difference there is that the actors are always someone else, or there might be some kind of a meta exploratory production or something, but for the most part, the actor's on the stage, and it might be a very political play, but the actor is not the actor. The actor is a different person. So that's something that really struck me about that. And then I happened upon that dance, and whoa, it like blew me away. It was so powerful. And I really recommend everyone here, just if you can just look it up on YouTube. It's so incredible and so stirring. I feel like in a lot of ways, the fact that you're still yourself makes it more stirring and more intimate. Is that something that you intended the readers to pick up on in your descriptions, or did it just write itself that way? I mean, because you're so, that's like a part of you, the dance. So I don't know if that was something where.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought of that, I have to be honest. I think it can go both ways. So in Hussein Simcoe's case, he is very much like, he brings a very complex story. So just to give the background, he is from Kurdistan, and he was trained as a breakdance dancer after seeing an American soldier who showed him a bit of the worm on an iPhone. And he was completely entranced by that. And then he went home and he looked at tons and tons of videos, and he learned how to breakdance from that. And he is incredibly talented, not to say that everyone can watch videos and become like a really amazing breakdance dancer, but he ended up dancing in various places in Iraq itself, and then he made it to New York. He's now in New York. So if anyone is watching from New York City, please look him up. He's doing incredible stuff. He now has his own company called Project Tag, and he does a lot of work on social justice. And I think there is something very unique about his work in which he is himself, and he has this incredible story that just bursts out of him. And it is a very, very special story. But on the other hand, so you also mentioned that when you introduced, so Pearl Primus, who's a wonderful, wonderful civil rights activist, African-American dancer. And she has this dance called Strange Fruit. You might know the song. The song is very, very famous. And in this dance, she takes the guise of a white woman watching a black woman being lynched. And I thought there was something really special about that, because, that's kind of taking the position of the spectator of a wrong that is done to your people. There's a very interesting theatrical operation going on there. And it's something that the spectator then has to engage with, of course, because the spectator then becomes a witness to the lynching, because the spectator is also like an onlooker. So to take your question, I think the dance really forces you to think about who you are and who are you speaking with and who are you speaking for. And perhaps in theater, I think also theater does force you to go through these processes, but maybe in a different way. And perhaps the very big difference is words. And you can't rely on words. It's just your body through which you're articulating a message. So, when Primus becomes a white woman observing a lynching, she is giving you the embodied experience of what that feels like. And when Hussein dances his Echoes Over a Bill, which is just a wonderful, wonderful dance, it's basically him reflecting on his hometown, to which he's not been back since he left, and what has been left of it after 2 imperialist wars, and what remains for him. So, he is embodying that for the spectator, and that's, again, a very unique experience. So perhaps it's the fact that you can't fall back on words to represent someone else, but you have to choose what embodied experience you bring forth to the spectator.
So you had written in the book a little bit about how art should be a reflection of the times and the culture in which it's created. And I had like a clip from that. You had written, art is a part of society, but it reflects the creator's voice. So you noted that the artist should feel like a part of society, but that also that he or she can change it. So this was towards the front end of the book. And then in the back half, when you started talking about refugees, I thought about it again. So feeling part of a society, but that you can change it. How does the concept of exile that you bring up later on in the book sort of play into this?
That's such a good question. So I want to say, I wrote about refugees for several reasons, because the so-called manufactured refugee crisis, there wasn't a crisis because people have been seeking refuge for forever, really. Then suddenly mass media has become obsessed with it and showed people arriving on boats. And then suddenly people had politicized the fact that some people are trying to arrive from various countries on boats, including, it should be said, countries that have been forced into drafts and part of imperialist wars and were forced into exile. So that was one position that I thought, why are we interested, and where does the concept of refugee meet us today? And, writing about refugees, I took two very conflicting standpoints. I start with a provocation, and then I go to the actual theoretical work. So the provocation comes from Hannah Arendt, who is, she's always influenced my thinking, a really important writer to me. I don't agree with a lot of what she writes, but she's still very important to me. And, she is a former classmate of my grandmother. She comes from a background that I know, that is part of my own biography. And she has this great opening sentence. Some people just know how to start essays well. And she writes, "At first, we do not like to be called refugees. We like to be called newcomers." And I thought about, no one likes being in exile. No one likes being homeless. No one likes not having a sense of belonging. And so Arendt was the provocation, but where the theory really lied for me, lay, I should say, was Edward Said, the great Palestinian intellectual thinker, literary writer, political theorist. He's a lot of things. My dear friend Jeanne Moorfield has a book on him, and a lot of my going back to him was through conversations with her, as well as, of course, he's a Palestinian. Really, he articulates the experience of a person in exile, especially exile in America, in a very forceful way. And I think this question of being outside of society and not even being counted and not even being part of what we see as human rights abuse and not being seen as oppression. I mean, in my new day job, I was dealing with a case that on Monday is going to the Israeli Supreme Court, where a Palestinian family is going to be dispossessed of its house simply because a settler took hold of it and abused a certain legal loophole. And, these are cases that happen here once a week at least. It's not a rare instance. So for me, thinking about who are those people whose voice is really not heard? Who are those people who don't make the news? And again, this is my critique of a lot of Western focus. I kind of now talk a lot about the West as if I was not educated in Oxford and lived in the UK until 2 weeks ago. But it is that, we forget those people who don't even have anything to fall back on, and who are completely oppressed in the news, who are not even part of the news. Ask yourself why. I'm sure none of you have heard about this court case before. Ask yourself why that is. Why does that not even make our news? And this kind of continuous dispossession, which again is part of my political education, it's what brought me to activism and what brought me to writing about activism, I think really sits at the core of what we need to think about in terms of social justice work. So a lot of the debates we're having now are really tweaks around the edges. They're talking about rights within nation states where people have access to certain restorative mechanisms and can go to an appeals court and have someone who will speak with them and for them. But the people I'm thinking about are those who don't even have that, who really have to scratch the surface of our shared being in order to have their voice heard. So I think, the concept of an exile is something that is very deep and important to me. As a Jewish woman, who's very proud of being a Jewish woman, comes from, there's a long legacy of Jews being in exile and thinking about what that means for them. But then being part of a people that is actively dispossessing another people and what that means in that kind of traction. So I think, it's not a very popular stand to have, and it's one that carries weight with it. But we really need to think about those people who are not even part of our collective imaginaries, who are not even counted. When we don't even think about them when we talk about who are the subjects that need liberation. So that was kind of the route I took with the question of exile.
But when you're talking about that and you're getting actually visibly choked up about it, I just keep thinking I'll watch the news when I get home from work, and it seems it seems what it comes down to nowadays is empathy, and there's a huge lack of empathy. I don't know if it's that people aren't capable of it, or if that they just don't, they're not capable of thinking about others in that scenario, or if they're not capable of the actual empathy. But like, it's really beautiful to talk about stuff like this with someone who says they care and they actually care.
So maybe we can talk about Eleanor now, because she was the driving force, and she thought with her heart. So I have to say, this is also part of the story of the book. So, and the story of feminism within the book. So the book uses a lot of the political theory of Eleanor Marx, who is Karl Marx's youngest daughter, but in her own right, the foremother of socialist feminism, and one of the greatest organizers, thinkers, really radical activists before we had a concept for that. And sometimes you read books that change your life. It doesn't happen a lot, but when it does, for me, it's a very profound thing. And I came across the biography of Eleanor Marx written by Rachel Holmes. I should say that I first heard Rachel speak about the book. I was completely blown away. I was like, I didn't know anything about this woman. I had no idea. I kind of said to her, very rude in hindsight, don't say that to a biographer. I didn't know he had a daughter. And I was like, you don't say that to someone.
I didn't know he had a daughter until I read your Rosa book. So
there you go. Yeah.
It also speaks a lot to, Western education and some problems there, but go on.
So I kind of said, oh, I don't know, that's really nice. And Rachel was very polite and kind, and she's a very important inspiration on my work generally. And she's an activist and an archivist and a curator and does a bunch of other things. And now has a wonderful new book on Sylvia Pankhurst. So check that out. Probably my next book will kind of be inspired by Sylvia, I guess. But I went away and I read Eleanor Marx Alive. It's been out with Bloomsbury since 2014. And it's really kind of, I was blown away. It completely changed my worldview. And I think I've read it like 15, 20 times just for fun. And then I started writing about it. And one thing that is really interesting about Eleanor Marx, apart from the fact that she really did intersectionality before it was cool, she really brought together the woman question and the class question in a flawless, theoretically and practically flawless way. But Rachel Holmes writes very beautifully that her socialism was socialism of the heart. And that's exactly what she spoke about. And that's what I was feeling that was missing in my world, both in a literary way and as an activist myself. And I thought, a lot of people speak the good language, but you don't see any intention there. So for me, just to say a bit of her achievements, because she really, she deserves also in her own right. She is the founder of the Gas Workers Union, which is now the GMB. It's the largest trade union in the UK. She wrote a text called The Woman Question from a Socialist Point of View in 1886, which really articulates how class and gender interact and how, you can't really talk about gender without class and vice versa. Any process of liberation will take gender at its heart, but also bourgeoisie feminism has its limits. And I was reading all these texts and I thought, it's like she's writing from now. These are the challenges of neoliberal feminism that we're standing against. But she was also a great cultural innovator. So she was the first person to translate Ibsen into English. She was a lover of Shakespeare. She really understood the political force of Shakespeare. She was an educator. She taught in working class schools and taught working class people about culture. She taught them languages. And I was thinking, we just don't have that ethos. We don't have a person who really understands that you just live that thing that you're fighting for. And when I came to write the book, it was clear to me that I can't do the very kind of easy way out, which is like, this is my theory and these are the case studies and look, this is my analysis, it crosses nicely. And I was like, no, this is not going to work. And I realized that she was the perfect person because she really is the person who lived the practice. She was so Rachel Holmes says she was the practice to her father's theory. And that was kind of the question that motivated the book. Like, how do you write about practice? How do you write about the actual activism, the action in the world? So I think for me, that was a transformative book. I recommend it to you with all my heart, especially these days, like it is a balm for the soul. And Sylvia Pankhurst's Natural Golden Rebel, which has just been published 2020. In the question of where those women pioneers in our psyche, why do we not think about them as often as we should? And how do we treat practice within the world of political theory? And I have to say, this is part of my own experience, that, a lot of people thought that I was like a nice quirk for, and say, oh, you're the one who's social in activism, you're the one who's actually interested in real world politics. And I should say that a lot of things changed, I think, on both sides of the Atlantic with respectively Trump and Brexit, because a lot of people were forced to think about practice in a way that they hadn't before. And then I think people like Eleanor really become important, because she really brought these two elements, thinking and action, seamlessly together. So she was a way for me to counter this question of like, how are you an activist and also a writer? Like, of course, you're doing both all the time, and you have to reconcile that.
Eleanor is really interesting. I want to learn more about her. I learned something new from your book. So the last time I read one of your books, I discovered she actually existed. And then in this book, I discovered that she was like friends with Mary Wollstonecraft, who I'm always been very fond of. Yes.
She was
reading plays with like Percy Shelley and Mary Wollstonecraft. I'm like, oh, sure, she's very cool friends. So yes, definitely, I'll be reading about her. Excellent. We'll have to do another event where we just talk about all the wonderful women.
Let's do it.
Let's see. So we do have a question, it looks like. If anybody else has any questions for Dana, please feel free to put them in the chat or on the comments on Facebook. They'll get to us, or the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. This one's kind of a long one. It's multiple parts, but the mass marches for Black Lives Matter and the women's marches were among the largest mobilizations in US history. It seems like they have had strong impacts on people personally, and at least some political impact, though it is unclear how great an extent. Although they express solidarity, are US mass movements missing an element of political action present in those of other countries? Or do we just need them to do more of them? Do your observations about humans and movement with your political philosophy training give you a way to help us understand this? So that's a very complex question.
Yeah, no, it's a great one. So I should say in parenthesis that I finished the book in June, which was before the Black Lives Matter movement. Otherwise, probably the next book, I guess I'll have to write about that. And I have to say, we should qualify and talk about the Black Lives Matter movement in the US and outside of the US, because I experienced it in Europe and it was completely different. We can talk about that. Women's marches, I wrote about that in the book. I think it definitely was transformative, and it definitely, it's important to think about where did the opposition to Trump came from first. It came from feminism. It came from women who said, no, we're not having it. And, the contingency that led to the book, I should say, is I had a fellowship in a really wonderful place called the Center for Ballet and the Arts at New York University. And it was one of those like incredible jobs that I was hugely privileged to have. And I lived in New York and I saw 3 dance shows a week and I danced in all the cool places. And then the election happened in 2016. And I was like, okay, I think my break from politics has ended this very moment. Like, until then, I was like, this is great. I could just do dance and not think about politics. I was like, okay, no, that ends here. And I actually went on several of the marches myself, and I helped organize one of them, which was an incredible experience for me. And I do think they are historical. And I think it's fair to say that if it wasn't for the women's marches, we would probably still see Trump in power. I think that shifted a lot of what is possible in terms of activism. What can people do by mobilization? It gave us a lot of new heroes. If you think about the Squad, if you think about a lot of women who came out of that ethos, that is completely out of that organization. Black Lives Matter is an interesting, and again, I'm qualifying here between the US and elsewhere, because I think, in the US, it's clear that there's a very direct continuation to the Los Angeles protests of the 90s, which I still remember as a teenager. And then, of course, going back to thinking about the civil rights movement, like there is a story that progresses and develops. And the honest answer is, I think we just don't know yet. It's very, very soon. Things take time to trickle down. Only when I was finishing the book, it was there is obviously I finished the book in June. We didn't even know what would happen in the election. I was like, please, may it be like a good omen for something better. But I think, I was, like everyone else, glad to see Trump out of power. And I think he was a very dangerous person in terms of equality, in terms of human rights. I do think, though, and that might be an unpopular opinion, and I'm an outsider, so you're welcome to completely ignore what I'm saying, that it's not enough to just elect someone who's not Trump, and not just to run on a platform that is basically like decency and going back to being civil. Because, a lot of the things that are at the heart of American society, as it is in Israel, I saw that immediately because that's where I'm from, is a very exclusive society, a society that has very little in terms of equality at its core. So I think Black Lives Matter did a lot of work in sort of bringing that to visibility. And I think especially those marches and those actions in June forced a lot of white people to consider their place, which was interesting to observe. But we need much more of a deep action, which, again, I don't think it's just about who you read and who you perform. That is part of it, definitely. And we should talk about what do we engage, but should be a really deep question about how does power, how is power organized in society? Who are those people who are continuously dispossessed? Who are those people who are continuously at the forefront of state violence? Who are the people who are in prison? I didn't use her a lot in the book, but I always go back to her. Angela Davis, great inspiration for my thinking in many ways. And, when you talk about the prison system in the US, and it's a for-profit system, part of capitalist ethos. Who are those people who are taking the brunt of it? There's a lot of questions that are far deeper and go more structurally, and not just a figurehead. So, I think it's really very important to get rid of, not to get rid, so this is like very violent language, to unseat a politician who is fascist, who is inciting for violence, who is a white supremacist. That is a really important step. But I hope that the work that has started will continue, and it won't be just like, oh, we haven't had different presidents, so it's fine. Now we can go back to our houses. And, sadly, we already saw a few shootings and acts of violence. These things just continue. So again, this is something that is far deeper than maybe so what I'm trying to say is that the catalysts for these movements are far deeper than what might be seen on the surface. But they're definitely very important. Just to end, to say something about the Black Lives Matter outside of the US, I can say from the UK and the Netherlands, where I've been teaching, there's a lot of denial of racism in Europe, I have to say. Like I lived in the UK and people are like, oh no, we're not really racist. Like just everyone is white, and you're like, okay. So it's like, let's self-affirm ourselves all the time. And especially after living in the US, I was very frustrated coming back to the UK and sort of having this discourse to engage with. But I think that a lot of the action forced also people in Europe to think about, police violence towards people of color, which is, again, very common also in Europe. It's not by far an American invention. And to think about the legacies of colonialism, it's very different to think about what it means to engage with the legacies of slavery, and which is, of course, the US case, versus the legacies of colonialism, where you can have a whole history where someone was living far away and manufactured things for cheap for you, and you didn't even see them. That's a very different process of reconciliation. It's not the same. You can't take the same model of social justice and activism and just implement it. And I think one thing we're seeing now in Europe, and a lot of the things that are now kicking off, are basically a reflection of that. And, one of the things that really frustrated me when I was talking to British people, like, oh, isn't racism terrible in America? And I was like, is racism terrible in the British Empire? Like, let's open that one up. So I think Black Lives Matter really pushed other countries to reflect on their own part of structural racism, of power relations that are exclusive. And again, what is the role of white people? Because that's one thing that has been very absent. Like, who are those people who are not in the conversation because they're comfortably outside of it and they don't have responsibility, but actually should be at the forefront because they have the least to lose. So it's their responsibility to act the most.
I sort of want to talk about, and it kind of branches off of that question, because we're talking about the Women's March and the
Mm.
Black Lives Matter protests and marches. You mentioned in the book, I think you called it like Dance on the March. I never thought of flash mobs as in terms of protest before. Like they're usually, or at least in America, what we see are like, you know, cutesy dance things, and then they go viral on Facebook and everyone's like, ooh, that's so cute, you know.
Yeah.
Let's distract ourselves. But you described it as solidarity in motion. Can you talk a bit about that for those who haven't read the book yet?
Yeah, so I think flash mobs are fascinating, and I've always been kind of, so I organized once one of them, and I took part in several others, and I observed a lot of them. And I think, you know, there's a lot of like dance trends that are now picking up that kind of push towards that direction. And anyone who's ever been on a protest knows that when the dancing starts, everyone joins it. Like it's kind of a moment of jouissance, of collective joy, of release. It sometimes has dark undertones. This is not to say everything is like joyful and forward-looking, but it's something that when you experience firsthand, you know, is a very kind of releasing moment to be part of. And I mean, I looked at different kinds of flash mobs. So, you know, there were the Extinction Rebellion ones, which I think that's another movement. So it wasn't in the question that I was just asked, but that's another really important mass movement that shifted the terms of conversation and really brought climate emergency to our headlines. Until then, you know, before Extinction Rebellion, everyone was like, oh yeah, environmental justice, isn't that a nice thing for people to engage with when they have time? You know, it's like, no, this is something we all have to think about. So they had quite a lot of flash mobs, and they have an interesting anarchist ethos, which going back to Eleanor Marx, you know, the history of the 19th century intellectual legacy is the fights between socialists and anarchists. And it was hilarious because looking at Extinction Rebellion, that history replayed itself. So you had the people saying, no, you're anarchists, this is really dangerous. And the people are like, no, actually, this is the way forward. But in terms of anarchism, it is a perfect suit because it is like breaking any terms and order and just like bringing people together to move together. But then I had another example in the book, which is again kind of from where I am right now, which is Dabke, which is the Palestinian national dance. And that was danced via through really violent uprising, violent, I should say, on the Israeli side. The Palestinian side was kind of an uprising in Gaza in 2018. So at the border, when you had Israeli soldiers shooting, you had resistance in terms of Palestinians dancing their national dance together, which I thought was incredibly powerful and showed kind of the beauty and humanity of resistance and where you can find, you know, collective solidarity, really. There's no other word I can use in this context. And I think I also try to diversify a little bit of what we think of as flash mob, which is kind of to do with your question. That is, you know, it's not that just those trends. And those trends are important also, I have to say, especially during COVID. I think, you know, being able to dance in synchronicity with other people through the web is really, really important. But there's so many other forms of dance that we don't even know about and that are really important to those who dance them. And a flash mob can be anything. You know, there was a kind of a ballet flash mob they did, like, so there's one of the favorite things I found, and the Paris Opera were on strike, and then they did like Swan Lake together as an act of protest, which I thought was incredibly cool. I had no idea before I started working on the book, and I was like, that is really neat. You know, and you wouldn't think of Swan Lake as like a subversive dance, but all depends on the context. So I think, you know, moving together in space is something that is really powerful. And again, it's kind of weird because I wrote the book before COVID, and now all that people are yearning to do is to be able to safely move together. Like that's what people are looking forward to. And there's something about bodies being together in space and moving together that, you know, we now understand. Again, after a year of being separated and being isolated, we understand very viscerally that human need. But yeah, we need to, I think, again, expand of what we think as dance, as flash mob, as a legitimate form of movement, which is part of what I tried to do in that chapter.
We're getting close to the end of the hour. I have at least one more question, but if anyone watching has a question, please be sure to get that in so we can ask Dana. It seemed like you conducted some in-person interviews for this one. Obviously you couldn't talk to Rosa. She's been gone for a long time. But for this
my
one,
God,
so
can you hear me?
how did you learn about some of these dancers, especially like Hussein and some of the Middle Eastern dancers? Are they well known in dance circles? Did you know them before? And if not, how did you find out about them?
I should say it was like chance. Chance is a wonderful thing. I was quoting Cunningham. Cunningham based his entire theory on chance. I got to know people randomly, and I kind of thought, and a lot of sequences in this book were just like standalone analyses that I kind of thought, oh my God, this person is incredible. I need to write about them. And then it came together and it became a book. And it was really weird because a lot of the interviews, I have to say, people have generously given a lot of their time. I'm incredibly grateful to a lot of people who supported this book from its inception. And a lot of the people I interviewed are close personal friends of mine. So it was also really weird to be like, I will now write about your work. How do you feel about that? I should say in this context that the book is dedicated to two of my best friends, Blakely White-Maguire and Leah Cox. Leah is, she's currently teaching at Texas, and she's the dean of the American Dance Festival. And Blakely is a former Martha Graham principal, a freelance choreographer, dancer, and a very special person in many ways. And I think talking to them really motivated the book. It was like a series of conversations, and we all have like these lengthy Skypes and discussions. And so I think for me, it didn't feel like an interview. It just felt like I was sitting with people I admire and asking them questions, and then it became a book, which is kind of a weird process to go through, but incredibly fun. I recommend to anyone who's thinking about process, like, interview your friends. It's just like, it's good times.
Sounds like the ideal. Like,
yeah, I know, it's like,
and it just writes itself.
This is work? No. In terms of other people I wrote about who are not within my immediate circle, some people I was introduced, and people who knew I was working on similar ideas were like, you have to meet that person, like you have to read about that person. And then I kind of got engaged through that. But yeah, a lot of chance. There's a lot, I think in every book, there's a lot of chance operations that work. And some writers admit that, and some writers don't. I'm part of the writers who admit that. But yeah, I was really, really lucky, I have to say, in my process, with incredible generosity of people who gave time and resources. I should also mention here, in this context, the Martha Graham Center for Contemporary Dance, where really the book starts and ends with the Martha Graham's Chronicle. Also, I should say in this context that today is exactly 30 years since Martha Graham died. So this is like, and we chose this date randomly, and it's kind of very apt. But I spent a year there as visiting faculty, and a lot of my conversations with Janet Aylber, who's the artistic director, Marnie Thomas-Wood, who's incredible, powerful Graham dancer from the 50s, really, still teaching, still dancing, and other generations of dancers who passed there really were important for the book and for how I was thinking about not just the Graham chapters, but like all of the book. So I'm very, very grateful to them.
So we're approaching the hour. It looks like we don't have any more viewer questions. I did want to say the program that we just watched was made possible by gifts to the New Haven Free Public Library. If you enjoyed this program, please consider making a donation at nhfpl.org/donate. To help support our collections, our programs, and the services we provide to the community throughout the year. And please join us again in 2 weeks. We'll be joined by D. Sales Harrison, who's a professor at Oberlin College. He'll be chatting about poetry and his first novel, The Waters and the Wild. And Dana, I do want to say also, I did a little digging, and it seems like we might be the only public library in the United States with your book. So if you enjoyed this program, guys, please, the book's kind of expensive. I do encourage you to get it. I think it was incredible. But if you can't afford it, at least push your libraries to buy this book, because it really is something.
The paperback is coming out next year, so at least.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And thank you so much for joining us, Dana. Like, this came together right at the last minute. We had an opening, and last Thursday I contacted Dana, and she just jumped right in. I didn't expect her to be available or able to get it together that quickly. But you know, you're always incredible. You never fail to amaze, and it's always such a delight to talk to you.
Yeah.
So thank you.
My pleasure entirely.
So much for coming and being with us today.
Thank you so much.